Welcome to the first podcast of the Latin American Studies program. My name is Raúl Diego Rivera Hernández. I am an associate professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, and I'm the current director of the Latin American Studies program. Today, I'm honored to start this podcast series with our former director, Cristina Soriano. Cristina is an associate professor of Latin American history at Villanova University. Soriano research has focused on the analysis of dynamics of circulation of information, social networks, political mobilization, and public sphere in the Spanish Caribbean during the Age of Revolutions. Her research has been supported by the Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the John Carter Brown Literary, the Albert Lepage Endowment Professorship in History, the National Center of Humanities, and the Latin American and Iberian Institute of University of New Mexico. Her first book, Tides of Revolution, Information, Insurgencies, and the Crisis of Colonial Rule in Venezuela, published with the University of New Mexico Press in 2018, received the 2019 Conference for Latin American History Bolton Johnson Award for the Best English Language Book in Latin American History, and the 2020 Fernando Coronil Prize for Best Book about Venezuela, awarded by the Venezuelan Studies section of the Latin American Studies Association. She has published articles in scholarly journals such as Ethnohistory, the Journal of Atlantic Studies, Global Currents, and Itinerario Journal of Imperial and Global Interactions. She is currently co-editing the Cambridge Companion to Latin American Independence and working on a new project on the effects of imperial transitions in the island of Trinidad. Cristina, welcome to our first podcast. We're very happy that you're here with us, sharing your expertise and your wonderful job and work that you have done with the program in the past 4 years.
Thank you, Raúl, for this invitation, and thank you for organizing this new podcast series. I think this is a great idea.
Cristina, let's start with your previous service at Villanova University, the 4 years that you have been working as a director of Latin American Studies. Can you tell us about what did you learn in these 4 years as a director of this program?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I started in 2016, as you know, after replacing Professor Satya Patnaik, and Professor Patnaik was the director for 25 years. So it was basically the first time that someone else was taking over the directorship of the program. And I thought at that time that it was a challenge, also because I felt I was relatively new to Villanova, but I thought it was a great opportunity to connect more with not only the Hispanic Latinx community of Villanova, but also to promote and encourage students to understand Latin America as a region and all the complexity of the region. So I think for me, the most interesting part of this job was understanding how every professor in our program bring a different perspective about the Latin American region. Like we have professor from the Spanish department, like you or Laura, or Agnese, who have a different perspective of Latin America, and is about literature, or in your case about immigration and crime wars. And then from political science or history would bring a different view. So I think the richness of the program is making sure that is a group of people that are coming from different disciplines, sharing our views about the region, but also sharing with the students the diversity and the complexity of the region, right? Like I think one of the most important challenges of the program is to teach our students that Latin America is such a complex region because of the history of colonialism, or the legacies of colonialism, the effects of modern capitalism, the effects of the Cold War. There's so many things that are happening in Latin America, and depending on the region, if you look at the southern cone, or if you look into the northern area of South America like Colombia and Venezuela, or if you look into Mexico, those things happen in different ways, and they involve different groups of people, and even the involvement of the US into this region is different. So So the idea is that the students are able to first understand that an interdisciplinary approach will give them a more rich idea of, Latin America, but at the same time to understand the diversity, the cultural and historic diversity within Latin America. So I think at the beginning, that was my first motivation, like make sure that the program can really talk about Latin America as a whole, and that can put US students, but also Latinx Hispanic students in Villanova in contact with the region. As you know, we have a program abroad. Right now we have, well, we used to have, right now is suspended because of COVID, but we had the Chile program during the summer, and that was a wonderful experience that our students had in a Latin American country. But because they understood the diversity before going to Chile, they knew that Chile has a very particular history, and then they were eager to know more and to, for example, compare Chile with Argentina, or Chile with Mexico, or Chile with Peru. So I think in that sense, the program was fascinating. I would say that the intellectual richness of the program was the first thing that kept me like interested in running it. Then I think, it put me in contact with different people at Villanova. And as you know, the program now is part of the GIS. We are under the umbrella of GIS. And being part of the GIS department was also a very rich and interesting experience, because it pushed me forward to think more of my work, intellectual work, in an interdisciplinary context.
What value do you believe that the Latin American Studies program brings not only to the University of Villanova, but also to the United States in a general cultural context?
Yeah, well, I think it's such an important moment right now in US history, and I think and US politics also. And I believe these area studies programs and at the universities are so essential, first of all, to teach some kind of a cultural intelligence or cultural literature to our students, to understand that there are different points of view, there are different perspectives about the world, to give them the capacity to be more critical about the role of the US and the way discourses of knowledge in the US are constructed from the US perspective, and help them understand how things are seen from other places. Like, just to give you a quick example, students in the US, they always talk about, for example, the Mexican-American War. And then one of the things that they learn with us is that's the way it was called in the US, but if you go to Mexico, it was the US invasion war. So that tiny example is just to show you how these programs can enrich their views, especially their cultural views about other regions. And I think they're not only necessary, but they're even required. With this, I mean that, in the last 10 years, private companies and institutions have been asking universities to provide with more students who have knowledge about the broader world and who know how to connect with people from other places, to be, intelligent in the way they manage with them, to understand cultural difference and take cultural difference as a benefit to any company or institution. So I still believe that area studies programs are essential in a university.
Can you tell us a little bit about the student that you're looking for, or the kind of student that is interested in enrolling in a major or a minor in Latin American studies? What they share in common, these students?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, because we have gotten all sort of students. We have a group of students who are Latinx students, and they feel that enrolling in a program connects them with, their family, it helps them understand their traditions. They even understand better why their families moved to the US. I have had students who, after taking our classes, have a more complete idea of, the kind of histories that are behind the decisions their family made when they moved to the United States, or they even have a more complicated idea of all the processes of migration and how difficult it is. And I think they're also they have more critical view about the migration problem in the US right now. So that would be one kind of a student that's looking more to understand their own family's stories and their own kind of a social networks and communities. Then we have the students who are usually US students or that are from American heritage or US American heritage, and they're just basically curious about the world, either because they traveled and they discovered that the world is more complex than what they imagine and they're fascinated by that, or because they are interested in conflict resolutions or international students, international studies, and they want to understand the region better. So I have had students who are majoring in communications or political science or peace and justice, and they do the minor in Latin American studies because they want to be able to apply those skills on a region in particular. And then they look for jobs in Washington or in a kind of a multilateral institutions where they can bring that knowledge about the region to those institutions. And then we have students that are just curious, that they just want to learn about the world, and they choose Latin America because it's either seen as a neighbor, the region as a neighboring region, or sharing the same American continent, and it's close enough for them to travel there if they want. And but their interest in Latin America is just out of curiosity. And after the years, after they graduated from Villanova, if they connect with us, they tell us how much they learned with the program and how much it had served them in their jobs. So yeah, I don't think there's a profile that we look for. I think we look for students who are open-minded, who are curious, who are not afraid of asking questions about other cultures and other traditions, and who can learn about the other without having a condescending attitude, right? Which is one of the things that, sometimes we struggle with in the United States.
During 4 years, you were the director of the Latin American Studies program, and at the same time, you were preparing a wonderful book, which title is Tides of Revolution, Information, Insurgencies, and the Crisis of Colonial Rule in Venezuela. This book was published in 2018 by University of New Mexico Press. And one of the very interesting things that you discuss in your book is that during the colonial Spanish America, Venezuela was like a very interesting country in terms of very little opportunities for the intellectual societies, for the elitist groups to have like different kinds of ways to share information through books, because Venezuela was lacking printing houses in that specific time. Mm-hmm. You're talking about the end of the 18th century in your book. So what was the reason that in Venezuela there were only a handful number of why Venezuela was one of the very few colonial Spanish American colonies that didn't have those printing houses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we usually see Venezuela as a peripheral area in colonial times. Like at the beginning, it was not a place easy to conquer and colonize because it was so dispersed, and indigenous communities were so dispersed that it was a place that was not easy to control. And Spanish colonizers would prefer to go to other areas like the Central Valley of Mexico or the Andean region, where they could take control of these huge and amazing civilizations or kind of a centrally administered societies like the Incas and the Mayas and the Aztecas, and it was like easier to control them, and that's where they put all the energy, the colonizing energy at the beginning. But they never abandoned the Caribbean region just because of strategic reasons and because of trading. And Venezuela is pretty much considered like a greater Caribbean region because it's so close to the Caribbean basin and it's there. But it was not until the end of pretty much the 1600s that Venezuela started to cut the attention of Spain, and because of cacao trading, which was the most important crop that they started to produce in Venezuela. And so it was like we see it as a peripheral society, but still, or community, economic community, but still with some importance in terms of trading and connections within the continent. And then because it was not so important, it was like the founding of schools or institutions of education took longer than in other places. Like if we compare it to Mexico, there's like 300 years of difference of the printing press being brought to Mexico and Venezuela. And Venezuela, as I said in the book, is one of the last places to receive this royal permission to have a printing press. And the reason would be that basically when Venezuela started to acquire important geopolitical position vis-a-vis the empire, the revolutionary or enlightenment ideas were already circulating, and people thought that maybe it was not so good to bring a printing press to a place that was so influenced by, you know, those currents of knowledge circulating in the Caribbean, which, you know, the Caribbean is such an interesting place because it's multicultural, multilingual. There's the French and the British and the Dutch and the Danish. And so it was, in a way, Venezuela was in such an open country to the Caribbean that it was better to preserve it outside the kind of a knowledge that circulated in the Caribbean. So that's why the printing press was never, I mean, they are petitions in part of the Venezuelan elite asking for a printing press, and those petitions were denied. And it was never explained why. They said, no permission for now. And of course, they were frustrated. And it's very interesting because in those letters, those elite members of the consulado, they would say things like, we need to produce our own knowledge. It's not possible that we continue reading books about foreign ideas and foreign places when we recognize that Venezuela is being productive, that the cacao trading market is very important and Venezuela is occupying an important place there. We need to be able to have a printing press so we can communicate our own ideas and to be producers of our own knowledge, basically. And still they denied that permission. So for me, that was always very interesting. It was like, why Venezuela doesn't have a printing press until so late? But then I realized there are people in Caracas, which is the colonial, and still today the capital city, there are people with amazing libraries. So those books were all imported either from Spain or Mexico in some cases. And they had the money to buy those books because they're making money out of the cacao trading, basically. And for me, the most interesting part is to realize that even though there was no printing press, Venezuela was one of the first places to declare the independence from Spain. And it was like a political hot place during the beginning of the 19th century. So my question was like, we always assume that revolutions are tied to knowledge and awareness of political knowledge and the emergence of a public sphere. And that doesn't seem to be the case in Venezuela. There is no printing press, and yet it's a place that's so important for Latin American independence, not only in Venezuela, but it basically ended exporting independence to the rest of the South American continent. So I wanted to understand, how was it possible for Venezuelans to be so informed about Atlantic politics, but yet they didn't have a printing press? So I have to find, an answer to that question.
So I guess my second question is very much connected to what you have just said. So in which way the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, ideas, values, ideologies arrived to Venezuela? If we don't have a printing press, if we don't have a strong intellectual society that could be disseminating these ideas, and if we have some kind of censorship working in that specific time period, how all these ideas were able to spread among a society in Venezuela?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and that's what I was trying to answer in this book. So for me, it has everything to do with the, first of all, geographic location of Venezuela. It was in a privileged position. That's pretty much, it was considered the gate, and they even said that in many documents, Venezuela was the gate to the South American continent. It was la puerta del continente. And it was connected to the Caribbean, which, as I already described, is such a dynamic, vibrant place because it's multicultural. There's so many European nations competing for the Caribbean resources. It was an incredibly hot place in terms of African slavery. And so Venezuela is open to all of that. And there have been a lot of historiography in the last 20 years about social networks and communications within the Caribbean basin. And there are foreigners coming to the Venezuelan ports, and oh my God, no lo puedo creer, perdón. I think that he will have to edit. Sí, ¿verdad? ¿Él puede editar? Ok, bien. Yo pensaba que desconectándolo se... Sorry. Okay, let me rephrase what I was saying. Okay, so Venezuela was open to the Caribbean, and these are commercial connections and foreigners coming to Venezuela and staying for some days in the Venezuelan ports and bringing ideas with them. So there's a clear circulation of news and rumors, not only about the Spanish American region or Spain, but also about what's going on in the British colonies, what's going on in the French colonies, in the French West Indies colonies, and in this case, what's going on in Haiti once the Saint-Domingue rebellion started, right? So for me, it's about understanding the circulation of goods, information, and people. Those are the three things that are where, so Venezuela doesn't have a printing press, but it was an incredibly connected place in terms of the Atlantic world and in terms of the Atlantic politics and commercial relationships. So that, if we look into the history of La Guaira, which is one of the most important ports, La Guaira was like a multilingual place. There are people who speak French living in La Guaira, people who speak English living in La Guaira. There are places where they're translating documents from English to Spanish or French to Spanish. And there's a lot of smuggling webs. Yeah, le puedo escuchar, es horrible aquí. There are smuggling webs, and so the trading and the people coming to smuggle cocoa or Caribbean goods within the Venezuelan coast are also bringing not only rumors and news and ideas, but also newspapers and pamphlets that circulated in the area. And so people will basically take a pamphlet and say, what is this pamphlet about? It's talking about, the northern rebellions of Saint-Domingue, and let me find if I see someone who could translate this for me, and I can understand better what's going on. So it's a very well-connected place. And those connections, we can feel it through the very open and flexible circulation of goods, information, and people.
So what you're saying in some ways that in your book is that this circulation of goods and information, it was not happening among the white Creole elite, but it was happening among free blacks, pardos, Indians, and slaves. So how these different groups were receiving this information, how they were adapting this information to the original circumstances that were occurring in that time in Venezuela?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the first things that in a way I wanted not to do with this book is that I didn't want to concentrate in one social group and not others. Because if I was looking at information and knowledge, I don't believe that, social groups are entangled or attached to one kind of information. I think that information and news is something fluid that can go through different social sectors and groups. And that was the first thing that I realized while I was doing this research, that people of different social backgrounds and ethnicities and social racial groups, they were aware of what's going on in the Caribbean. They were aware of what's going on in the French, with the French Revolution, and they had questions about it. Basically because there were ideas attached about equality, about abolition of slavery, that they were interested in finding more about that, right? So in one hand, we have groups of people, which are the pardos, also known as mixed races or castas, who are people of mixed origin. They are either their parents are white or people of color, and they're mixed. And they represent the 45% of the Venezuelan population. So there's, demographically speaking, is the largest group in colonial Venezuela. And those groups could even have economic power, but they were never allowed to have political power. They were never allowed to have any position in any colonial institution. And not only that, they were not even allowed to have an education. So in the public schools, they were not allowed, kids of Pardo were not allowed in public schools. They were not allowed to enroll in the seminary to be a priest or to be a lawyer. So they felt they have many restrictions. So of course, those groups were interested in understanding how equality would look in Venezuela. When the French sans-culottes or Jacobins were discussing equality in France, they wanted to know what if we have equality in Venezuela, and how will that look for us? And basically it would look very good for them, because if they represent the 45% of the population, they thought about why don't we take control of the country through a process of equality, for example. The enslaved people in Venezuela did not represent more than the 20%, but they were most of them concentrated in the coastal area of the country where they had the cocoa and sugar plantations. And they also had questions about the abolition of slavery, on the possibility of being free people, right? So they would try to join the conversations and follow the stories, especially about the Haitian Revolution, which, as you know, is the only successful slave rebellion that ended on a revolution, the only revolution that declared the full equality among the races and the definitive abolition of slavery, like any other revolution during that time. So it was basically the most radical revolution of the Atlantic revolutions, meaning the Haitian, the American and the French. And those ideas, I mean, Haiti is not very far away from Venezuela. So there are many, ships coming and going from Venezuela to Haiti, or from Haiti to Santo Domingo, Español, and then to Venezuela. And people are learning about the Haitian Revolution. And again, thinking about how to translate those kind of ideas into the Venezuelan context, which I think is the most interesting thing. How do you not only learn about something, but transform that knowledge in a way that's meaningful for you and your group of people, right? So that's why I talk about translation happening at two levels. One is a literal translation, basically taking a French document and translate it into Spanish. But the other would be a more figurative translation, which is taking concepts that made sense in France and translate it into a concept that could make sense in the Venezuelan context. So to give you a very specific idea or example, there was a song that was created in Venezuela. It was connected to a conspiracy, kind of a Republican conspiracy that erupted in the town of La Guaira. And that song is very similar to a French song, but it replaced the word sans-culotte by the word shirtless, which is descamisados. So instead of talk about the sans-culotte, it talks about the descamisados. The descamisados are going to be free. The descamisados are going to fight for freedom. The descamisados. So it's a literal translation in one hand, but it's also a figurative translation. It's saying, well, we don't have sans-culottes here, but we have people who are poor and they don't have shirts and they're shirtless, and they also have political participation, or they want to have political participation. So that for me was the most interesting but also challenging part of writing this book, because of course history, you don't see a lot of documents talking about how people of lower social groups think politically, because the idea of the white elite is to depict them as apolitical. They're not intelligent, they're not smart, they're dumb, they're innocent, they're naive, they're only following a foreign political program, they don't have a program on their own. And so for me, the most interesting part was looking into kind of a trial documents where they interview those people and you can hear what they think, or what they thought about the political movement that they joined, and how they created their own texts and they make those texts circulate. And since there are no printing press, then I see them as semi-literate people, so people who could find ways to get access to the written text, but then they could translate that into an oral media.
Would you say that in this case, this group of people, los pardos, the Indians, slaves, and free blacks, were some kind of counter sphere or counter public sphere to the original intellectual sphere of the Creoles in Venezuela? Maybe the word public sphere doesn't work in this case because it was more like an underground sphere of people who are discussing and debating these ideas in the context of Venezuela. Would you say it would be like a counter interest from them than what the ones that were perceived by the white Creole elite in Venezuela?
Yeah, definitely. They're bringing, but there are also some white members of the society who have radical ideas, and they share this interest on the French Revolution or the American Revolution, and they join that group as well. So I do treat them as I call this a incipient public sphere, because the spaces that they control, well, I mean, is underground in the sense that the colonial state is struggling to find the places where this is going on, right? So they don't understand, they don't find a tavern or a coffee shop or a printing shop where this is going on. But that doesn't mean that people in the town know about these places and they're semi-public. They were, I mean, there's a barber shop that's a public space where everyone is going to learn about the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. So I see that as a public sphere, but it's a public sphere that's socially and ethnically more diverse and complex than the typical Habermas idea of a public sphere. So I believe that in Venezuela there is an incipient public sphere that's socially more diverse and complex than the typical Eurocentric idea of the public sphere that we have in the historiography. So, but there's still, I mean, there's still need in part of the colonial state to try to control these spaces that they suspect exist, but that makes it more interesting. The lack of printing press at the end ended up being a benefit, or it ended up being a positive situation because people just basically spread the word and were more efficient in spreading the word because the state could not control the space. So that's what I'm able to, I mean, that's one of my arguments, that it ended being very prolific.
Well, you published Tides of Revolution in 2018, and you're now working on a co-editing project for the Cambridge Companion to Latin American Independence. Now you're going to be on sabbatical. You're working on a new research project. Just to finish our conversation, can you let us know which is the next step of your research? What are you going to be doing in the next year that you're going to be exploring new venues?
Yeah, so I continue interested in understanding these permeable spaces of imperial control. Like I was so impressed on how, you know, the presence of French people in La Guaira, the presence of British people in the western part the eastern part of Venezuela, because then the island of Trinidad, which used to be part of Venezuela, was invaded by the British, and there's a lot of British influence in that part of Venezuela. And that fascinated me. So at the end, I decided to look more into these kind of inter or trans-imperial spaces and how people navigate a trans-imperial space. So I'm looking now into the history of the island of Trinidad, also because I accumulated an incredible number of documents from my previous research that basically could not go into the book. And it's a lot about how Trinidad, which was in theory an island that was part of Venezuela, at some point it became so full with French immigrants from Saint-Domingue that it was a Spanish island with a French population, and then it was invaded by the British. And that made it even more complicated because at some point, and I'm talking about 1802, Trinidad is an island under British control with mostly French population being ruled with Spanish laws. So that's, yeah, because the British decided that in order to keep things under control, they decided to keep the Spanish laws for 12 years. So it's the British crown ruling, but the laws are Spanish. And it's very interesting because not even British colonial authorities can understand the Spanish laws very well. So it's a trans-imperial space that's very messy and difficult to understand. But I think that this is where it comes, this idea of the Caribbean as an undisciplined place that no one can really understand. So I'm proposing to be part of this more epistemological debate about how can we understand a multicultural, multilingual, trans-imperial space like the Caribbean. And I think Trinidad is going to be my focus, but those are the kind of questions that I'm asking.
Cristina, thank you very much for being our first guest in our podcast series of the Latin American Studies program. We wish you the best of luck in your next project, and we look forward to hear more about these permeable spaces of imperial control and from this Caribbean as an undisciplined space. Thank you for your hard work at Villanova University. Thank you for the research, and keep us posted with all the projects you're going to be developing in the next year.